All right, today we're going to get started on section 4 of chapter 7, so make sure we're in chapter 7 packet and the notes start on page 10. Now, with section 3, we looked at our triangles, and section 4, we're looking at quadrilaterals. Now, hopefully you know that quad actually stands for 4, so quadrilateral is just a shape that has 4 sides. So make sure you fill that in up top there. Now, the diagram below shows the properties of the different types of quadrilaterals and how they're related, but the important thing that's in bold there is that when you're identifying a quadrilateral, you want to use the name that is the most specific. So if we kind of just glance down at the chart, if something is classified as a square, we wouldn't want to call it a parallelogram because there's a more specific name that can be attached to it. So as we're looking at the chart here, the quadrilateral that's at the top, of course, just has 4 sides, it's enclosed, and there's nothing really special going on with it. Now, if we kind of go to the left-hand side here and look at the trapezoid, it's a quadrilateral with exactly 1 pair of parallel sides. So something that is new is that if you look at this little bubble here, when you see arrows on the sides, that is saying that those 2 sides that have the matching arrows are parallel. So on a trapezoid, you only have 1 pair of parallel sides. Now, if we jump over here to look at the kite, just because it's another kind of on its own shape, it's a quadrilateral with 2 pairs of congruent adjacent sides and opposite sides that are not congruent. So this is important right here, the congruent adjacent sides. So you can see on the diagram, just like how we had with our triangles, we have those congruent tick marks. The difference with these ones is that they're not opposite, they're exactly adjacent, which means they're next to each other. So we have those 2 double tick marks on the right, and then we have the single tick marks on the left that show that those 2 sides are congruent. Something that also happens inside our kites is that these 2 angles here that are across from each other and in between those congruent adjacent sides are also congruent. So that's just something to kind of keep in the back of your head. Now, our main quadrilateral here, our parallelogram, is a quadrilateral with opposite sides that are parallel and congruent. So you'll notice on the shape there that we have the 2 sets of congruent and parallel arrows. So the side to side are the same, and then we also have the top and the bottom that are both congruent and parallel. Now, as a result of this, we also have that these opposite angles in our parallelogram have to be the same. Now, if you notice the way I'm drawing it, those 2 angles are different. So we have the top left is congruent to the bottom right, and the top right is congruent to the bottom left. So it's kind of like those opposite angle effect. Now, with the parallelogram, if we kind of get more specific, we have our 3 last shapes. So if we follow the arrow down first and look at the more specific ones with the angles, we have the rectangle. So a rectangle, yes, is a parallelogram, so it has those opposite sides that are parallel and congruent, but it also has 4 right angles. So by definition, it's a parallelogram, but with 4 right angles. Okay. Now, if we go to the other side and get a little more specific with the sides, a rhombus is a parallelogram, so again, still has those opposite congruent parallel sides, but this time all 4 sides are the same, so you can see that those 4 congruent tick marks are there. So the rectangle is a more specific parallelogram, the rhombus is a more specific parallelogram, but in reference to the sides. Now, if we take those 2 and kind of mesh them together, that's where we get our square. So it's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. So whenever we're seeing these markings on here, it's really important so we know the difference between all 4 sides being the same. Do we have those right angles or do we not? Or is it just a standard parallelogram with the congruent sides and parallel sides? This all might seem kind of redundant because you're probably thinking, well, I've seen this shape before. Why are we taking so much time on the definitions? But whenever you're going through and trying to classify them, these little details are important because, again, you can't assume what you don't know, so you need to go based off of what's given there on the picture. So if we take a practice down here to classify these quadrilaterals, again, you want to think, what do I have and what does that mean for my shape? So for the first one there, I see that I do have 4 right angles, and I have these 4 congruent sides, and all 4 are the same, so the most specific name I can give this is my square. Again, yes, a square is a parallelogram, it is a rhombus, it's also a rectangle, but the most specific name would be square, so you would want to put square there. Next, if we look at part B, So I see I have congruent sides, but notice that they're next to each other. They're not across from each other, and there's two different pairs of them. So the only thing that fits under that description would be my kite. So if you're kind of getting the hang of it, you can go ahead and fill in the other two. I'm going to keep talking, but you can always pause or just ignore me. So for part C, okay, I see these 4 congruent tick marks, and that's really it. But you can tell just based off of the shape that those congruent sides actually do lead to them also being parallel. So this would be our rhombus. Okay, because again, the fact that they are congruent, they also have to be parallel, just kind of like a give and take when it comes to the rhombus. Now on part D, I see once again that I do have these 4 right angles, and I also have congruent sides, but if you notice the tick marks, these 2 are congruent with the double tick marks, and then I have these 2 separate sides as a different part of the congruence. So I have 2 different congruent sides, but then I have all those right angles. So this one would be our rectangle. So again, when identifying, make sure you're as specific as possible and you're not assuming what you don't know. So again, basing it off of those right angle boxes, the congruent markings, and any parallel arrows if you were to have any. Okay, so the last part of our quadrilaterals for now is if you look at the top here, all of these shapes are quadrilateral. So I see a parallelogram on the left. I have what looks to be maybe a square or rectangle in the middle, and then I have just a standard quadrilateral on the right-hand side there. So just like triangles, rectangles always have to have a standard number of degrees, but that's kind of what helps them be classified as a quadrilateral. But it's not 180 because we have more angles. It's actually going to be 360 degrees. So inside every quadrilateral, no matter how big, small, wide, is 360 degrees. Now that's important because if we're trying to find a missing angle, we want to make sure that we're taking away from 360 and not stuck in our kind of triangle world of 180. So there's a couple of ways you can do this. Again, doesn't require too much work if you'd rather just kind of do some subtraction on your calculator, but if you wanted to set it up with some kind of equation, if I'm looking at part A here, I see I have x, 115, 70, and 75. So again, the whole idea behind our quadrilaterals is that if I add up all of the angles, then it should equal 360. So I add up the 115 and the 70 and 75, and I get that x plus 260 is equal to 360. Solve for my x. And I get that x is equal to 100. Now you can put the degrees in there, but if you notice the x already has it up in the corner, so you don't need to, so x equals 100 is perfect. All right, again, if you want to try the other ones on your own as I go through them, go for it, or just ignore me and pass through it to get the answers. So for part B, I see I have 100, 180, and x. So just to kind of save me some time here and do some mental math, I get x plus 280 would have to equal 360, and just like before, to solve for x, to get rid of the 280, and x, of course, is equal to 80. So again, degrees or not, that's fine. For C, still the same thing, just be careful, make sure that you see this 90-degree box in there. Okay. So now again, if you're just using a calculator, you don't have to set it up with the 2 equations I used above. You could just take 360 and subtract the 3 angles that we have. Or if you wanted to add up the 90, the 81, and then the 124 and then subtract it, you'd still get your x. So when all is said and done, subtract all of that, and I get that my x is equal to 65. So again, either this way that I did in part C with the subtraction, or if you want to do kind of like an adding and then subtracting that final answer, it's still the same steps, just set up a little differently. But again, it's completely up to you as long as I can see some kind of work going on there. For the last one, I'm just going to go ahead and subtract. So I know that x is going to be equal to whatever 360. And again, if I kind of do this a little mentally, minus what 230 is. And 360 minus 230, of course, is 130, so x is equal to 130 degrees. Okay, so again, just be careful, make sure you're using 360 instead of 180 as long as we're dealing with quadrilaterals. Now the chart that's down below here is kind of made to incorporate all of the shapes in one place. You can kind of compare and contrast, but let's save this till tomorrow so we can kind of go over and I can make sure everybody got the gist of these notes. Last thing before you get started on the last activity, I would like you to complete the puzzle. It shouldn't take you too long because you're just kind of identifying shapes and then solving for X for those last few. Just make sure that whenever you go through to answer that the letter that's over on the right-hand side here corresponds with the numbers that are down below. So if I look at the first one and I see 4 congruent sides, and that's about all I know that number 1 has to be a rhombus. So for the rhombus, I'm looking at letter E. So when I go down to 1, I should write in E. Okay, and you can complete the rest just like that. The answer should make sense. What's the healthiest insect? So make sure it does, and then you can move on to the last activity.